Hi. I finished the original 12-book Thieves World Anthology series. The individual books are reviewed in other videos, and in this video, I'll give an overall review of the series as a whole. My experience with anthologies is that they're often really uneven. Stories can vary widely in tone, quality, and length. Even a themed anthology can have issues maintaining a consistent direction. Another problem is that they sometimes mix introspective fiction and plot-driven fiction to an irritating degree. I don't like it when I read a really great short story with good characters and action, then get an introspective slow piece with an ending that's difficult to interpret immediately following it. Sometimes even an author's interpretation of what belongs in the genre and what follows the theme can be different too. The premise of Thieves World, which was unique at the time, was what if a bunch of authors wrote stories using a common setting and they were allowed to use the characters that each other created in their own stories? I'm going to start up front with the biggest problem with Thieves World, the rules about using another author's characters. Let's say Andrew Offutt created a character and CJ Cherry used that character in another story. Cherry wasn't allowed to make major changes to the character's personality or kill them off. If the reader knows which authors created which characters, they know nothing major is going to happen to that character if another author uses it in one of their stories. This often completely removes any tension there might be for that character and the actions that they take. Off the top of my head, I can only think of two named characters that were actually killed in the Thieves World stories. Both of those were actually kind of minor characters too. Anyway, I'll go over some of the themes, what I didn't like about the series, and what I did like. So what are the themes in Thieves World? Brotherly love runs through many of the stories that involve a group of people called the Stepsons. The Stepsons are soldiers that care for each other, and each one has a warrior that they always fight next to, among other things that they do together. This creates a lot of tension whenever one of the stepsons strays or gets killed because it's unclear how the man's partner will react. Will he become a shell of himself? Will he lash out? Will his fighting ability suffer for it? Will he leave soldiering altogether? It's an interesting theme that could have led to some interesting interactions. Another theme is revenge, though sometimes it isn't about the revenge itself being enacted. It's more often about the person that the revenge has been enacted upon dealing with the consequences. For example, there are a couple wizards in the story that are dealing with curses that cause problems for finding any kind of love in the future after the curse was laid on them. Another example is that one woman might want revenge for the death of her child. One woman wants revenge on a lover that spurned her. The question they often ask is what I got for my actions worth the punishment that I'm dealing with now? Another theme is the power of the gods. Can they just make things happen, or do they always need human avatars to enact their desires? One trope I'm not a huge fan of in fantasy is when the gods come down and participate in events. Thieves World overused the gods in the mix trope to the point where I rolled my eyes every time a god was even mentioned. I just got so sick of it after a while. It diminished in the last few books, but was really annoying in the first half of the series. Another theme that sometimes comes up is parental love. This is often mentioned in stories featuring Illyra and Gilla, who is Lalo the Limner's wife. Both women go through some things that most parents hope to never go through, and it shows the aftermath of dealing with that. There are also some characters that have some serious moral ambiguity. The Hellhounds deal with this when the near immortal soldier Tempest makes himself judge, jury, and executioner for Jubal the crime lord's hawk-masked minions. Jubal himself has a certain business-driven ethics, but he's a slaver after all, so how ethical is he really? Another slightly morally ambiguous character is Shadowspawn. He's a thief, but he won't kill if he can avoid it. Another character is Kurd the Vivisectionist. He performs horrible experiments on slaves in the name of medical science. Is it worth it? Not to the slaves, for sure. There's also a constant fear of the unknown running through these stories. It ranges from one character not knowing how another character will react, to fear of what's in a strange place, to the vast uncertainty caused by the base of occupation or the new emperor's plans. These are just a few of the themes in these stories. I'm sure there are others that you might see if you read the books. So, what didn't I like about Thieves World? The arrival of the Basib was hinted at least 2 books before they actually showed up in Sanctuary. Once they got to Sanctuary, their presence was mostly a dud. It was stated that the Basib occupation negatively affected residents. However, only one story actually showed the Basib in action in a highly oppressive way when they were doing public executions. Most of the characters in Sanctuary carried on like everything was business as usual. Maybe because the residents were used to being cautious, so it was just one more thing to watch out for. I don't know. Either way, there was very little real impact aside from the occasional sentence here and there about how people felt about the Basin. The stories never really showed them being oppressive, nor did they show many one on one interactions between Sanctuary residents and the Basib. For the buildup it got, the Basib arrival just didn't affect most of the stories enough. There's also a long plot line about the fight between the stepsons, Roxanne the Witch, and Ishade the Vampiric Magician. It runs over many stories across multiple books, and Book 8, Soul of the City, is devoted to it, with all 6 stories focused on all the characters that are involved in any way. It was detailed and convoluted at times, and it was more like an episodic novel than a short story anthology. It did create a sense of an overarching history and plotline, but the stories were often tedious with all the viewpoints that were involved. And I just didn't care about most of the characters, but I'll tell you more on that in a minute. There's a slaver abductions plot line that starts happening in the last few books. It wasn't introduced as if it would take center stage the way the Basib arrival was built up, so it isn't hugely prevalent. However, it does have a significant impact on a couple characters, so it felt like its effects were more significant than the results of the Basib occupation. Then again, this slaver plot was near the end of the series, so that might be recency bias kicking in for me. Another thing I didn't like was that after the first few stories featuring Ishade, Stratton, Critias, Roxanne, and a few others, the stories with those same characters started to have a soap opera nature to them. I got to the point where I just didn't care much about any of the characters and their interactions with each other. The stepsons were pretty much 2 dimensional in that they only cared about the reputation of the stepsons and what Ishade or Roxanne the Witch was doing. I just didn't care after a while, and the too many viewpoint stories with these characters often felt like a chore to finish, so I could just get on with the next story. As I just stated, the stepsons, Nico, Yanni, Critias, Stratton, etc., had very little depth, and I rarely cared about most of them. Nico was about the only real exception to that. Nico's history relied a bit on the tie-in novels that Janet Morris wrote. However, enough background information from those tie-ins was given in the stories that involved Nico so that you didn't have to read the tie-in novels to understand what was going on. With all that said, there were a couple moments where it felt like the short story was an advertisement for the tie-in novels. So I've mentioned a couple times now how some authors crammed too many viewpoints into some stories. Those viewpoints often had no real impact on the story. They just seemed like a method of propagating the continuing plot lines of other stories. I get that this may be a little necessary in a shared setting. However, I would have preferred the story relevant info that's given in those excess viewpoints to have been worked into the viewpoint characters that the stories were actually about. Or just give me an omniscient narrator to hand the info over more succinctly. I would have liked it probably better that way. I do think that one part of Sanctuary that wasn't used enough was Jubal's criminal organization. Sanctuary is actually called Thieves World by some of the residents, and that extends to all crime. However, there wasn't enough use of Jubal's crime organization. There were probably a ton of story opportunities that were passed up on because of that. I'll talk more about Jubal and what I liked about him in the next section. Speaking of organizations, there were too many soldiering factions in the city. You had the Hellhounds, which were Catechithus's personal guard and security leaders in the beginning of the series. Along with them, there was the City Watch or the City Garrison, whatever you want to call it. Then the Stepsons showed up, and then the Rank and Third Commando showed up, and then the Basib soldiers showed up with the Basib occupation, and there was an assassin group with them known as the Harka Bay, which I do think that's kind of a cool name for an assassin group, but whatever. Then the Basib arrival led to the creation of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Sanctuary, or the PFLS, which was also called the Piffles by some people. The PFLS was born even though, as I already stated, the Basib didn't seem all that oppressive in the first place. The point is, there was a lot of militant organization juggling going on in some of the stories. At least one story led to a big battle royale in Sanctuary, and I couldn't tell if it was all the interior factions fighting or if it was an external force attacking. It was just really confusing. The last of the bad story or setting points I'd make is this: the closing of the series, i.e., the last two stories, was lackluster and disappointing. I was hoping for a big mashup with all the great characters, but the penultimate story focused on the garrison commander who's named Wallegren and his personal desires. It was very blah. The final story was basically a bar conversation. It was more interesting, but only because it left the door open for some future story possibilities with a couple characters. However, this being the last book, who knew if anything more would come of it? There were a few character things that I thought could have been used more if any of the authors had wanted to try. There was a mage named Randall who was a shapeshifter. He appears in 11 stories throughout the series, and his shapeshifting ability only affects the plot in 2 of those stories. That could have been used a lot more, I thought. Another character named Snapper Joe is a demon that was summoned as a result of something that the witch Roxanne did. After his tie to Roxanne is gone, he just roams Sanctuary and occasionally works at the Vulgar Unicorn, appearing in the occasional story. It felt like his purpose was comic relief after his first appearance. It just seemed like a waste to use a demon like that, even if he was kind of a weak demon. There was also a character in one story who is probably a werewolf, but the author, Mark C. Perry, only wrote that one story for Thieves World, and the character never appeared in anyone else's stories. His action in the Perry story is mostly off screen, so the reader doesn't get to see him in action either. I found this disappointing since I'm always kind of curious about an author's take on werewolves. All right, one last character complaint. In general, too many characters were touched by the gods. Tempest is a near immortal soldier because he's Vashanka's avatar. Jihan is a soldier and sort of girlfriend of Tempest. She's also the daughter of the Lord of Dreams, who seems to be a magician who is so powerful the gods elevated him to godhood. But I'm not sure that that's actually what happened, though. Chinea is a gladiator who can't lose because she's favored by the god Savankala. Even one of my favorites, Hans, aka Shadowspawn, is given favor by the gods at one point so he can fight another god in human form. It's just too much there's just too much godly intervention going on here. It's just not one of my things that I like much. The way the gods were handled also puts me in mind to think that they aren't really gods, more like they're very powerful aliens or something that observe Sanctuary and have rivalries with each other. Kind of a mix of the gods are watching for entertainment and maybe Star Trek's Gamesters of Triskelion episode. Last but not least, on the things I didn't like, I love animals and don't like seeing them hurt or abandoned by their owners. In several of the stories, Heron is a healer who is mixed up with a couple gods, and events lead to Heron's dog Tyr, or Tyr, Tyr, being left in hell. Granted, the dog and the Queen of Hell like each other, so maybe it's not such a big deal, but it felt like Heron just abandoned him at the end of his own character arc, and I didn't like that. My overall sense of Thieves World is that promises were often made yet not followed through with. The Basib threat loomed and was mentioned for 2 whole books before they arrived, then not much impact. On the other hand, the stepsons were too prevalent in many of the stories because Janet Morris, CJ Cherry, and sometimes Lynn Abbey were busy developing a whole continuing plot line with them. With all that said, in the author's defense, we are talking about a series coordinated, written, and edited together in the 1980s here. There were no internet chat rooms and no Zoom meetings, so they could easily set up through lines for their plots. Even though I didn't like some of them, it's actually impressive that Morris, Cherry, and Abby were able to create the continuing storylines that they put together. Here's something that's kind of a neutral thought on these books Many of the stories come with a distinct inability to just read them without knowledge of previous stories. And this could be a knock, but it's kind of neutral ground. There has to be some shared background between stories happening in a shared setting. However, sometimes I felt like the plot of some stories just relied too much on knowledge of previous stories. If you're reading all the books one after the other, that's not such a big deal, but it cuts down any random read or reread possibility. So, after all that, you're probably asking, what did you like about these? What kept you reading? I would say that Andrew Offutt's stories in the series were mostly enjoyable. Some had a few problems, like extended setup or bits that could have been better left to brief paragraphs instead of pages of detailed scene. His character creations, Hans, aka Shadowspawn, Audio Vision, also known as Audio, and Strika Faraka, were some of my favorites in the setting. All three were different in unique ways instead of just being the same character in a different clothing and with working a different job. Another bright spot in my mind was Diana L. Paxson's Lalo the Limner stories. Lalo's stories all flowed from his artistic abilities in a natural way. The natural progression of his life and abilities made it seem like Paxson had a long term plan for where Lalo was going from the moment she dreamed up the character. The Lalo stories could have easily been a collection of connected stories and been coherent and enjoyable all on its own. The next thing I liked was Robin Wayne Bailey's writing. His stories contained the perfect amount of character introspection and external action. The only other thing I've read by Bailey was called The Lake of Fire, and that's a novel in Philip Jose Farmer's The Dungeon series, which was done way back in the 80s. I enjoyed the series as a teenager, but that was, 35 plus years ago, so I can't say how good that really holds up nowadays. I do still have a copy of it, so maybe one of these days I'll reread it. The rest of what I liked about the books was mostly character focused. I read the first few Thieves World books in the 80s and remembered Shadowspawn as one of my favorites. Reading the entire series this time diminished that a little bit, but he's still near the top of the list. His survival attitude seems realistic for Thieves World, and he seems like a decent person deep down, even if he is a thief. He doesn't like to kill, after all, and he does his best to avoid breaking the heart of some of his younger female admirers. Lalo the Limner is probably my overall favorite character in the entire setting. He seems like the most complete character in the entire setting, thanks to Paxton's full character arc that plays out over the Lalo stories. He has real concerns that ring true to me as an adult, so I could relate to him pretty easily. A couple other Andrew Offutt creations that I really liked were Strick of Faraka and Audio Vision. Both are good men that do what they can to help people who need it, and they don't seem to ask for much, if anything, in return. It's too bad they weren't more prevalent in the series. I was a little disappointed that Audio always stayed so low profile when he was way more powerful than most people around him knew he was. I also maintained kind of a soft spot for Illyra, the half Sedanzo fortune teller, throughout the entire series, too. She went through some serious crap and dealt with most of it pretty well. In the early stories she was in, she didn't sit back and wait for crap to happen to her. She took action. Near the end, she was a little broken by some things that had happened, and even then, she started to improve. I always found myself rooting for her when she was in a story. A character that isn't in nearly enough stories is Caravan Master Samlor Hill Somt. I really liked this character, but he was only in 3 stories, and they usually had a good mix of action and character development or background info to make him very interesting. I will say the final story he was in was quite disappointing, but it doesn't change my liking his character. David Drake did write a novel called Dagger, which is supposedly starring Samlar, but it's not readily available. Hopefully, one of these days I can stumble across a copy and get to read that. There were a couple magic users in Sanctuary that I felt a little sad for. Enos Jorel was the first one introduced in the series. He's cursed to change into a new shape each day, and sometimes it's a human shape, other times it's something horrific. Enos has a lonely life and wishes to die because the wizard that cursed him also gave him immortality, so he'd suffer forever. Unfortunately, by the end of the series, there was still no resolution for poor Enos Jorel. He's mentioned in one of the follow-on anthologies, but I doubt that it'll say what happened to him in the end. The other magician I feel bad for is the vampirically cursed Ishade. Her loneliness comes from the fact that any man she sleeps with dies, so she can't really fall in love with anybody either. I liked this character a lot. She seemed mostly content to deal with things as they came along, and she didn't take crap from anyone. She also never hesitated to jump into the fray whenever she was needed. She also seemed like a somewhat tragic character since she was destined to never know love. Of the 97 stories in this series, the only one that I rated a 10 out of 10 was the one where she was introduced, which was called Ishade and is in Book 3, Shadows of Sanctuary. One magician that wasn't doomed to a sad existence was Lithand, or Lithand, I don't know how you really want to say it. He didn't get enough page time in the series, though his creator, Marion Zimmer Bradley, did put together a collection of 20 stories called The Complete Lithand. It's still available as an ebook, so I'll have to get it one of these days and learn more about the character's adventures once he left Sanctuary. Perhaps the linchpin to most of the stories was High Priest slash fighter slash magic user Malin Torchholder. He was a common thread or presence in 28 of the 97 stories in the original 12 books. He had a network of informants, so he knew most of what was going on, and that sometimes came into play in the stories. The different authors seemed to write him fairly consistently too, so I think they felt the same way about him being central to a lot of the plots. Further evidence of his importance is that he's one of the characters in Lynn Abbey's novel Sanctuary, which was published in 2002, 13 years after the original series ended. Another character I liked was Felderin the Thespian. He's a good person that isn't afraid to get a little devious when he needs to be. It was too bad he didn't appear until near the end of the series because I think more stories with him and his theater troupe could have been really interesting. And lastly, we have Jubal, crime lord, slaver, former gladiator. He's a criminal, so his code of ethics is very business oriented, but that was what made him kind of interesting and gave his perspectives more weight. Some of the conversations between Jubal and other characters gave me trains of thought that I'd never considered before. Robert Lynn Asprin did a really good job with that aspect of the character. Unfortunately, Jubal wasn't used enough in the series, and it's too bad that the two newer anthologies don't use characters from the original series because I think a little more exploration of Jubal's activities could have been a good read. Overall, I felt like Thieves World did a good job capturing the grittiness of the world. Despite the rule about an author not changing or harming another author's character too much, I didn't feel like characters were ever too safe from something happening to them. There was always a what bad stuff is about to go down feeling to many of the stories. Another thing about this series is that it didn't spend a lot of time with the nobles in this world. Prince Governor Catechithus did show up from time to time, but was rarely a focus for very long. The Basib leader, who was named Shupanzi, did have some page time here and there. Emperor Theron was also seen or mentioned in a few scenes, but never really took over a story. That was about it for the nobility. The stories mainly focused on the little people in the world: soldiers and fortune tellers, madams and mages, shopkeepers and tavern owners, priests and thieves, all the people that made Sanctuary a vibrant, dangerous, and interesting place. So, those are my impressions of the series as a whole. The most common rating that I gave to the individual stories in the series was either a 6 or a 7 out of 10. 27 stories had a 6, 27 stories had a 7. So that's 54 out of the 97 stories in the original 12 books being either a solid story or a notably strong story. Overall, I'd rate the entire series about a 6. It's good enough to spend some time with as long as you don't get too hung up on some of the larger story promises the authors seem to make, especially the promises in the introductions. Focus more on what makes the characters and the world itself interesting and ignore the inconsistencies that the editors warn you about in the editor's note in the first few books. I think it took me about 10 or 11 weeks to read through the entire 12 books, roughly a little more than a book a week. If you read a story or two each night, or maybe 40 to 50 pages a day, then you'll end up finishing in about the same time. I still have 5 tie-in novels from the original series. 3 of them, Beyond Sanctuary, Beyond the Veil, and Beyond Wizard Wall, all focused on a war that takes place north of Sanctuary near the capital city of Rank. Two others, Shadowspawn and the Shadow of Sorcery, focus on Shadowspawn's adventures outside of Sanctuary. And then there's Lynn Abbey's 2002 novel Sanctuary that I mentioned earlier, as well as two other anthologies called Turning Points and Enemies of Fortune that have more than 20 more short stories for me to read and review. I'll get to all those one of these days, but I need to take a break from Thieves World for a while and get some other stuff read. For now, I hope you enjoyed this review and we'll check out some of the other videos on my channel. Bye for now.